Jason Isaacs wasn't part of any gang. He didn't carry a knife, didn't owe anyone money, and wasn't the type to look for trouble. At just 18, he was known in his Northolt neighborhood as a quiet, respectful teenager with a solid group of mates and a future lined up in carpentry. But on a calm October night in 2017, Jason's life was stolen in a matter of minutes. Targeted and hunted down by masked riders on mopeds, armed with knives, and driven by a postcode feud Jason had nothing to do with. The public first saw it as another sad statistic, another teen killed in London's growing knife crime crisis. But this wasn't just another stabbing. This was an execution in the street, carried out with precision, with no clear motive beyond territory, revenge, or mistaken identity. The sheer brutality shocked even hardened detectives. For 3 days, Jason clung to life in hospital before succumbing to his injuries. What followed was a painstaking investigation, a trial that would expose the culture fueling these attacks, and a family left to pick up the pieces. This is the story of Jason Isaacs, a name that should have faded into adulthood, not headlines, a victim not of who he was, but where he was. Saturday, 14th October, 2017 started like any other for Jason Isaacs. It was a mild autumn evening in Northolt, West London, and the 18-year-old was walking along Newnham Close with a few close friends. They weren't out causing trouble, just young men enjoying a quiet moment on familiar streets. But around 10:30 p.m, everything changed. Out of the silence came the roar of engines. 4 mopeds, headlights off, sped round the corner. Each carried masked riders, faces hidden, intentions clear. Witnesses would later describe how at least 2 of them were visibly armed with large knives. These weren't petty thieves. They weren't looking to rob or scare. They came to do damage. Jason and his friends scattered. Panic overtook them as they bolted in different directions, trying to get away. But the attackers zeroed in on Jason. He was chased down by at least 3 of the riders. The ambush took place near a narrow alley just off Newnham Close. There, the group surrounded him, and in a savage burst of violence, Jason was stabbed 8 times in the chest and abdomen. Neighbors rushed out after hearing the commotion. They found Jason collapsed, alone, barely conscious. Paramedics arrived at 10:32 p.m. and rushed him to St Mary's Hospital in Paddington, where trauma teams fought through the night to save him. He was placed on life support as his family gathered at his bedside, hoping for the impossible. Jason never regained consciousness. 3 days later, on Tuesday, 17th October, he died from his injuries. Just 18 years old, with no criminal ties, no enemies, and no warning, Jason Isaacs had become another name in London's growing list of young murder victims. But this wasn't random. It wasn't senseless either. Not in the minds of the killers. It was about postcode beefs, territory, and status. And now the hunt was on. Not for Jason's killers alone, but for answers. Why him? Why that night? And who was responsible? Jason Isaacs was the kind of young man who stayed out of trouble. Born and raised in Northolt, West London, he was known to his family and friends as calm, polite, and steady. His mother, Sharon Kendall, described him as quiet but confident, someone who made good choices and always put family first. Jason wasn't a troublemaker. He was an apprentice carpenter, learning a trade, working hard, and focused on building a future. Not once had his name come up in police records. He had no links to gangs, no history of carrying weapons, and no known enemies. Despite this, Jason's life was stolen in the most calculated of ways. The attack wasn't random, nor was it opportunistic. It had the hallmarks of a targeted ambush, planned, deliberate, and brutal. Masked assailants arrived on stolen mopeds, armed with machetes, headlights turned off, faces covered. The street was quiet. The group approached quickly and silently, split apart the group of friends, and chased Jason alone. There was no struggle, no fight. It was a pursuit, a hunt. And yet, the question echoed long after the blood had been cleaned from the pavement. Why Jason? He wasn't affiliated with any gangs, hadn't posted threatening messages online, and wasn't known to be involved in any postcode rivalries. But in London's volatile gang landscape, innocence doesn't always matter. Sometimes being young, male, and in the wrong postcode is enough. In 2017, knife crime in London had surged. Youth violence was at a peak, fueled by postcode feuds, social media call-outs, and drill music videos that often glorified revenge. Northolt itself had seen rising tensions between rival crews, with control of estates and road reputation becoming life or death stakes. Within this climate, Jason became a target, maybe by mistaken identity, maybe by association through friends, or maybe simply because he was there. The tragedy of Jason's case lies not only in his death, but in its complete senselessness. He was doing everything right, working, staying close to home, focusing on his goals, but none of that mattered to the ones who came for him. In the aftermath, his family were left with a reality that no parent should face, explaining how a son who lived right could be killed so wrongly. Jason's murder wasn't just a loss, it was a reminder no one was truly safe. In the hours following Jason Isaac's murder, the Metropolitan Police launched a major investigation. From the outset, officers were clear. This wasn't a random stabbing. It bore all the marks of a gang-related ambush: multiple assailants, stolen mopeds, weapons concealed until the last moment, and a coordinated escape. But the question that haunted the early stages of the inquiry was the same one Jason's family were asking. Why him? Northolt, like many parts of West London, had seen a sharp rise in knife crime. And while Jason had no gang connections, detectives couldn't ignore the context. The attackers moved with purpose. They weren't robbing, they weren't intimidating, they were out for blood. Officers knew that meant this wasn't spontaneous. It was a hit, likely tied to postcode rivalries that had claimed dozens of lives across the capital that year. In the days after the attack, police appealed to the public for witnesses. Local residents were urged to check doorbell cameras, businesses combed through CCTV, and the surrounding streets were swept for evidence. The community response was strong. People were horrified. Jason wasn't known as a troublemaker, and many in the area knew him or his family. The idea that someone so ordinary could be killed so violently hit hard. A major breakthrough came from forensic work. One of the mopeds abandoned after the attack was examined, and a crucial piece of DNA evidence was discovered. It linked directly to 18-year-old Joel Amade, a name that hadn't previously come up in connection to Jason or his circle. But the DNA didn't lie. Amade had handled the moped used in the murder. With this lead, detectives began building their case. They tracked the moped's movements before and after the attack, using CCTV from traffic cameras, residential streets, and local shops. In total, they reviewed hundreds of hours of footage. Each clip helped to piece together the journey the riders took, their route in, the ambush, the escape. They also revisited witness statements. Some described the way the group moved: fast, silent, determined. Others recalled the chilling image of young men with large knives bearing down on Jason. Each detail fed into the wider picture. While the killers had tried to vanish into the night, they left enough behind. For police, it was now about proving intent, showing that what happened to Jason wasn't chance, and it wasn't a case of mistaken identity. It was murder, pure and planned. The turning point in the case against Joel Ahmadi came not from a confession or a witness naming names. It came from meticulous police work and the quiet certainty of forensic science. One of the mopeds used in Jason Isaacs' murder had been recovered not far from the scene, and forensics teams combed over it in painstaking detail. What they found was decisive: DNA matching Joel Ahmadi. Ahmadi was just 18 years old, the same age as Jason. But unlike Jason, Ahmadi had chosen a different path, one that would ultimately land him in the dock at the Old Bailey. Once the DNA evidence placed him at the scene, detectives dug deeper. They obtained CCTV footage from every street within a mile of the attack. What emerged was a clear, damning timeline. The footage showed a group of masked individuals riding in formation. Their mopeds had no lights on, their faces were covered, and they were seen circling the area before the attack. After Jason was stabbed, the group was caught on camera speeding away. Crucially, one of the riders, matching Ahmadi's build and clothing, was seen fleeing alongside the others moments after the stabbing. Further analysis placed Ahmadi in the vicinity before, during, and after the ambush. Investigators had built what's known in criminal cases as a golden hour sequence, tracking the suspect's movements across that critical window of time. With forensic evidence and visual confirmation in hand, police had their first suspect. But the case wasn't over. Detectives believed that up to 4 young men had been involved in Jason's murder. Identifying the rest proved harder. The mopeds were stolen, the clothing nondescript, and the attackers had planned the ambush well. But even as the manhunt continued, Ahmadi became the face of the prosecution's case, the one whose DNA betrayed him. Police continued to appeal for information. They hoped the community might help name the remaining attackers. But as the trial date approached, the Crown Prosecution Service focused its efforts on what it could prove beyond reasonable doubt: that Joel Ahmadi was at the scene, took part in the attack, and was responsible for Jason Isaacs' death. It would now be up to a jury to decide if that was enough for justice. On 18th March 2019, Joel Ahmadi stood in the dock at the Old Bailey, charged with the murder of Jason Isaacs. For Jason's family, it was the start of a long and harrowing process, facing the young man accused of taking their son's life, hearing in detail how that night unfolded, and hoping that justice would finally be served. The prosecution presented a methodical, evidence-heavy case. They outlined how Ahmadi, alongside 3 unidentified others, had orchestrated a deadly ambush using stolen mopeds. Jurors were shown CCTV clips tracing the group's movements as they circled the Northolt estate, appearing to search for a target. Ahmadi's DNA, found on one of the mopeds, tied him directly to the group. It was damning. What the jury saw and heard over the course of the trial was chilling. The attackers had planned their moves. No lights, masks on, weapons drawn. Once they identified Jason, they split from the group, chased him down, and delivered 8 stab wounds in rapid succession. The medical examiner confirmed that the injuries were deep, targeted, and immediately life-threatening. The defense offered no alternative explanation for the presence of Ahmadi's DNA on the moped. They could not account for his movements that night. They could not produce alibis. The evidence was overwhelming. In closing statements, the prosecution made it clear this wasn't a scuffle or mistaken identity. It was a pack attack, a street execution. Joel Ahmadi didn't need to land the fatal blow to be guilty. He was part of it, knowingly, and willingly. On 12th of April 2019, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder. 5 weeks later, on the 28th of May, Joel Amade was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 20 years. Judge Mark Dennis described the attack as planned, targeted, and utterly ruthless. Inside the courtroom, Jason's mother, Sharon Kendall, delivered a victim impact statement that silenced the room. Her voice breaking, she spoke about her son's warmth, his future, and the unbearable void left behind. It wasn't justice that day. It was the closest thing to it. But as the verdict was read out, there was no cheer, just silence, heavy with loss. Joel Amade's sentence was clear-cut: life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years before parole could even be considered. For Jason Isaacs' family, it was a measure of accountability, but not closure. The young man who had chased their son down and helped take his life would now spend the prime of his own behind bars. Yet the courtroom victory was tinged with frustration. Joel Amade was only one part of a wider attack, and the others who rode with him that night have never been identified. Detectives continue to appeal for information. Though Amade's conviction was a major breakthrough, it was never the full picture. Police believe at least 3 others were involved in the ambush, including those who wielded blades and struck the fatal blows. But the code of silence that often protects gang operations has held. To this day, no further arrests have been made, and the murder remains, officially, only partially solved. The Isaacs family are left living with the weight of unfinished justice. Jason's mother, Sharon Kendall, has channeled her grief into campaigning, pushing for stronger youth services, tougher policing strategies, and greater investment in prevention. In interviews, she's spoken about the trauma of seeing her son on life support and the unbearable reality of having to bury him. "No parent should have to go through what we did," she said. "We need real change." The sentencing hearing itself was somber. Judge Mark Dennis told Amade the attack was ruthless and orchestrated, part of a broader pattern of youth violence terrorizing the capital. He acknowledged that while Amade may not have been the one to wield the knife, his role was pivotal, and that his silence since arrest showed no remorse. Jason's friends and family filled the courtroom that day. Some cried, some sat in stunned quiet, but all carried the same sense. This wasn't justice in full, it was justice in part. The fight for answers continues. So does the fight to stop this happening again. Because Jason Isaacs should be 25 now, building a life, not remembered in eulogies and headlines. His killers took his future. The courts took one of theirs. But the streets, for now, remain unchanged. Knife crime in London has become more than a statistic. It's a social emergency. Behind each headline is a family devastated, a future stolen, and a city struggling to reconcile its image with its reality. In Jason's case, it exposed how postcode feuds and youth violence have made even the most ordinary streets dangerous. These aren't isolated incidents, they're patterns. The question is no longer whether we have a problem, it's whether we're willing to face it head on. Because until we do, stories like Jason's will continue, each one a tragedy foretold, each one a warning left unanswered.